Hello there, boos and ghouls. It is once again October, which means it is my favorite season of the year. Halloween series 2024! Yay! So, this year, for Halloween, I'm doing black horror, or horror noir, as it's sometimes called. In this case, I'm doing films, but this could be films, literature, media of any kind that focuses on the experience of Black people. This may be African, this may be Afro-Caribbean, this may be African-American, and indeed the films that I'm going to be talking about for this series are all African-American driven films. Typically African-American majority, if not entire casts, often directed, written, whatever it is, produced by African Americans. And black horror tends to, though doesn't exclusively, tends to focus a lot on elements of race, racism, and the violence inherent in a racially hierarchized society.
So this Halloween 2024 video is going to be about William Crain's film Blacula. Now this was a Blaxploitation film, and it is actually kind of an important one in that it launched the genre of Blaxploitation horror, if you consider that to be an important thing. In sort of cinematic history and African-American cinematic history in particular, it's definitely an important film. Blaxploitation, of course, is a complicated genre. Broadest sort of brush strokes, it's a genre that emerged really in the 1970s. And it, on the one hand, sort of fetishizes and exoticizes African-American culture. It depicts these often depicts these very sort of stereotypical, hip, urban African Americans. And so in that sense, it's negative, right? The exoticization, the fetishization of a particular culture is definitely problematic. On the other hand, the genre actually did increase visibility, increase acting opportunities for African-American actors. And as much as it promoted sort of stereotyped and not necessarily, I don't want to say good because that's a vague value assessment, but as much as it promoted sort of problematic depictions of African-American culture, it did nonetheless bring depictions of African-American culture to mainstream American film-going audiences. And so in that sense, there were positive elements to it. Now, Blacula is very much in this tradition. It capitalizes on visually recognizable and linguistically recognizable stylistic aspects of African-American culture from the 1970s. We have multiple scenes set in a nightclub with a funk band performing. We have characters, particularly Skillet, who speak jive. I'm on the fence about the term jive, if I'm honest, because on the one hand, I feel like it probably was a real term. On the other hand, from the perspective of 2024, and maybe because of the movie Airplane, I feel like it's a term that white people made up. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you know the origin of the term jive, the etymology of this term. Anyway, not that important. So we've got those elements, right? But the basic storyline, I actually think is fairly interesting. So there was negative criticism of this. There's been positive reviews, but negative feedback seems to be fairly dominant. So I'm getting this from Wikipedia's reception section of Blacula. The two that I'm most interested in, the Monthly Film Bulletin, at the time, in 1972, I think. Yeah, 1972. So the Monthly Film Bulletin described the film as a disappointing model for what promised to be an exciting new genre, the black horror film, and that apart from the introductory scene, the film conspicuously fails to pick up on any of its themes' more interesting possibilities, cinematic or philosophical. And then the other one that I'm really struck by is that Time Out, which is a sort of film reviews conglomerate, I guess. I don't know exactly. More recently, they said that it remains a lifeless reworking of Heroes versus Vampires with soul music and a couple of good gags. So I'm really struck by this idea that the film is not doing interesting critical work, or that it's a simplistic story of good guys versus bad guys, because I absolutely disagree with that. I think that's an incredibly bad reading of this movie. So what do we have actually going on here? We start in Transylvania, where this African prince, Prince Mamuwalde, has come with his wife Luva. So there are plot holes here, and I'm going to talk about the plot holes. This is one of them for me, right? So Mamuwalde and Luva have come to Europe to campaign for the abolition of the slave trade. 1780s, perfectly legitimate, right? There was rising anti-slave trade sentiment. I don't know that any African prince or rulers or dignitaries or whatever it is came to Europe to join the anti-slave trade movement. I don't know that. It may be. There may be records of it. I have no idea. I don't find it out of the realm of possibility. What is, to me, a plot hole is that Mamuwalde goes to Transylvania. I don't know if you know this about Transylvania. In the 1780s, nobody in Western Europe would give a shit about Transylvania. Nobody would care what a Transylvanian thought about stuff. The primary people doing the slave trade were people along coastlines, particularly the British, but also the French, the Dutch. These people were the ones primarily doing the slave trade out of Europe. Transylvania is not along the coastline. They have no seafaring interests. They are in a landlocked area of Eastern Europe. And nobody would really care what they thought in Western Europe. So Mamuwalde going to Transylvania to try and campaign against the slave trade doesn't really make any sense. That being said, it is a plot device to get Mamuwalde into Dracula's castle. That's the entire purpose of it. It's a nonsensical premise for getting him there, but it achieves the ultimate end. Because Mamuwalde basically is like, hey, you are pretty uncivilized, Europeans, and Dracula takes exception to this. So he turns Mamuwalde into a vampire. He curses him to be, basically he locks him in a coffin. And the idea is that Mamuwalde, now rechristened by Dracula Blacula, you see where he's going with this, that he's going to be locked in this coffin forever. He will forever thirst for blood, but he will not be able to sate his thirst, etc., etc. Time goes by, 2 centuries roughly, and Dracula has been killed, and his castle is now being bought by 2 interior decorators, Bobby McCoy and Billy Schaefer. They're gay. the only reason I mention that is because this is one of the most problematic areas of the film from the perspective of 2024. There is a good amount of homophobic rhetoric and stereotypical homophobic bullshit. But Bobby and Billy buy Dracula's castle. They take stuff out of it and they bring it back to Los Angeles, including the coffin in which Mama Walde is still locked. They're going through this stuff. They break the coffin open. Mama Walde comes out. He kills both of them, feeds on them. Yep. From there, basically the middle portion of the film is Dr. Gordon Thomas, who is the sort of Van Helsing hero figure, realizing that something is wrong in Bobby and Billy's death. There's something about it that doesn't make sense. And he starts sort of investigating, figuring it out. He's sort of working with Lieutenant Jack Peters, who's a white cop, but sometimes Peters is like, no, just go away. Stop doing it. Stop looking into this. But really it's Gordon Thomas who's driving this investigation. Along with his wife, I think, girlfriend at the very least, Michelle Williams, who is the sister of Tina Williams, who is played by Vonetta McGee, who is the same actor who played Luva. So we got that element. Mama Walde is out in this world of 1970s Los Angeles, and there is a woman who looks exactly like his 200 or some years dead wife. And so Mama Walde pursues her. He genuinely does try to romance her. This is not like there are points where he glamours her, right? I think that's a fairly common term in vampire lore, where he sort of hypnotizes her, mostly to get her to go places. But he does say that he does not want to compel her to join him as the undead. He wants her to choose that out of love. Throughout the course of the center of the film, Mama Walde also kills/vampirizes a number of people, including Juanita Jones, who's a cab driver who just sort of randomly gets vampirized. He ends up vampirizing a number of random people, police officers, whatever it is. So he's got a decent-sized army of vampires, maybe 6 or so. By the time Thomas really puts together what's going on and figures out how to fight back. So basically that's all happening, right? You've got the whole core part of the film that's just somewhat meandering through the vampires are doing stuff that's too crazy to believe, gathering evidence, becoming convinced aspect. Tina is falling in love with Mama Walde, but she's on the fence about becoming a vampire, until in sort of the big climactic scene at the end where they've been hunting down Blacula, and they're in the final climactic scene takes place in this chemicals factory. They get just like 1,000 police who descend upon the area, along with Dr. Thomas, Lieutenant Peters, and somewhat strangely, Michelle Williams. She has a different last name than Thomas, so I'm guessing it's girlfriend, now that I think about that. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so Michelle Williams comes along. I guess in the interests of sort of recovering her sister, whom Mama Walde has sort of hypnotically brought to this chemical factory, but it seems very odd that Thomas, who otherwise is pretty protective of Michelle, would let her go on this vampire hunt. Anyway, so Tina gets shot by a police officer. Mama Walde then beats that police officer to death, as he has done with several others, and he vampirizes her. Thomas and Peters get to Mama Walde's coffin, and so this is actually another sort of bit of inconsistency, I think, or another bit of weirdness, right? After Tina is shot and Mama Walde turns her into a vampire, he then yells his threat that he's going to kill everybody in the chemical plant. That he addresses Thomas specifically. He addresses Dr. Thomas specifically, but he says, all of you are going to die. I'm going to kill all of you. No one will escape. So then slightly later, Thomas and Peters get to Blacula's coffin. Peters takes a stake, ready to drive it into his heart as Thomas sort of pulls the coffin lid open. So it pulls the coffin lid open, stakes, but it's not Mama Walde. It's not Blacula. It's Tina. So Tina is now dead-ish. I mean, it takes her a little while to die, even though she's been staked through the heart. And I think that's usually a quicker process in most vampire movies. Whatever. I don't know the physiology of it. It's mythical creatures, probably. So Tina/Luva is now dead. Dead, proper dead. Can't be brought back, dead. Peters and Thomas are then like, oh no, where is Mama Walde? And Mama Walde's like, I'm here, gentlemen. It's actually a pretty fucking classy, badass moment. Because he literally is like, and is William Marshall. So he has this very deep, resonant, commanding voice. And he's like, I'm here, gentlemen. That was a terrible William Marshall impression. I apologize to the estate of William Marshall. But you get what I'm saying, right? It's this really, really cool moment, actually. And he's basically like, step away from her body. He goes over to his dead beloved's side. Dr. Thomas goes to pull the cross out of his jacket, and Mama Walde is like, you won't need that. And then, with the love of his life dead, he goes up to the roof of this chemical plant, and he walks into the sunlight where he dies. So again, I want to come back briefly to those reviews. The idea that this is philosophically boring and the idea that this is just heroes and villains. What the fuck film were they watching? I mean, Mama Walde is such a complicated character. Like, the opening portion, sure, interesting. The fact that he's come to Europe to campaign against the slave trade, and he himself is then enslaved in this sort of eternal suffering of being the undead. And then for him to turn around and to vampirize others. Now, sure, the film does not really go into the ethics of that, right? It's raised implicitly by that initial framing, but it's not really discussed. The only person that Mama Walde has any sort of ethical qualms about turning into a vampire is Tina. And this is mostly because he wants her to choose to be with him rather than to be compelled to be with him. And so in that sense, there is an implicit contrast between the treatment of Tina and the treatment of people like Bobby McCoy, Billy Schaefer, and Juanita Jones, who each get turned into vampires against their will. Again, the film doesn't overtly deal with that problem. It's a problem raised by the series of events, but not necessarily a problem that is explicitly addressed. And I don't think that's a huge problem necessarily. I don't know that the film is really interested in that or that it needs to be interested in that. But the idea that this is a story of simple heroes and villains is a massive misreading, in my view. I mean, Mama Walde is not just a villain. Yes, he kills a number of people, he turns a number of people into vampires. But we have the extenuating circumstances that Dracula cursed him to do these things. Dracula has cursed him, and so Mamuwalde, he does not have free will in that sense. Like, he has a physiological need to do these things that are very negative and very problematic. That doesn't get him off the hook. He is still a bad character in the sense that he kills people, commits violence, turns others into vampires, etc., etc. But the weirdness of threatening to kill everyone after Tina is shot and is going to be turned into a vampire to live with him forever, versus accepting her ultimate demise and going out into the sun to end his own life, feeling that he has nothing left to live for. That's a really stark contrast, right? And the only way that I can make sense of that, because it doesn't logically make immediate sense, right? Tina gets shot, now she's going to be a vampire. He gets what he wants. He gets Tina slash Luva to be alive, well, undead with him forever. That's what he wanted. So in a way, the cop who shot her did him a favor because he gets what he wants. Why threaten to kill everyone over that? It would make much more sense to say, you have staked my beloved vampire Tina in the heart. Now she is dead forever. Now I am going to take my revenge on all of you. But Mamuwalde doesn't do that. And that's very interesting. There's one reading I have of that would make that make sense, which is that when that cop shot her and compelled Tina to accept becoming a vampire, he took away her freedom of choice, right? She could no longer freely choose. I mean, if the alternative to choosing to become a vampire is death, then it's a compelled choice. And what Mamuwalde really wanted for her is for her to choose, for her to be able to choose. And ultimately, he wanted her to choose to live with him. But I get the sense that if she had said, I don't want to be a vampire, that he would have respected that. So I think that's actually really interesting and really a complex character trait. And so those who sort of take the movie and say, it's a simplistic heroes versus villains, vampires versus vampire hunters stories. No, I absolutely disagree with that. I think it's actually a remarkably complex movie in terms of Mamuwalde's responses to the things that are going on around him and the ways in which he treats Tina and the ways in which he sort of constructs an ethical worldview.